Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I want to apologize for a moment. I had to take a little break. I was getting a little wiped out with summer and everything going on with my kids and school starting and yada yada yada. But now I'm back, and I'm back 100%. And tonight I've got an extraordinary Dogman encounter to share with you. Before I get into that encounter, a couple of links I'd like to share also. As you know, I'm a commercial-free channel, so I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch links to help this channel grow and go. Also, I have a second channel, which is primarily based for creepypasta, fan fiction, and scary voice acting. If that's anything that you're into, follow that link and give that channel some support. And with that, guys, let's get on with this encounter, shall we? This was not a report I myself witnessed, but instead one my grandmother told me about that my aunt later corroborated independently, so I think they're trustworthy. At the time, I'll note there wasn't much talk of Dogman, as this was about a decade before the infamous song came out. Though there were talk about wolves or werewolf-like monsters in Appalachia for a long time, so my aunt and grandmother just always called it the wolf thing or wolf creature. For a little background, my grandparents' currently aunt's home is in the backwoods of western Grayson County, Virginia, which to this day is still sparsely populated outside of one or two large towns on the east side, and back then it was even less so. Extremely thick forests with hilly terrain in all directions. You have to get on a dirt path and follow it for about a half a mile to get to a gravel-colored side road, and then follow it for 30 minutes to reach a very small town just across the North Carolina border. If you go a short ways north, you'll find yourself at the Blue Ridge Mountains and Parkway that lead up into Appalachia proper. The forest is mostly low-lying shrubs, up to around 4 feet high, with pine and a lot of black oak trees making up the canopy. There is a very clear stream about 30 yards from the house, which has fish quite frequently. This, along with wild blackberries, tender leaf shrubs, and some apple trees, make it very lucrative for wildlife. The house itself is an old 2-story home, built onto an incline of a hill that overlooks it. This was back in the 1970s. My aunt believes it was 1978, as she was finishing high school at the time. My father had graduated from college and was going on to the Air Force, so he had already moved out. My grandfather, although he was old enough to retire, liked to remain busy, so he worked his old job as an electrician and power pole technician, just now in an advisory role because he was getting up there in years. He had just gotten the contract down in North Carolina, so he was away from the house for about a week and a half. This left only my 17-year-old aunt and grandmother at the house. As I said, there usually was a lot of wildlife in the area. A typical morning for my grandmother was making breakfast and sitting out on her porch watching deer and rabbits eat the shrubs. Sometimes she would also see or hear a bobcat, fox, or coyote about. On one occasion, a mountain lion and her cub strolled right past the house. One animal she was familiar with in particular was a large black bear who could be recognized by folks around those parts with a white patch on his chest and hole in his left ear. My grandmother nicknamed him Captain because he had a habit of sitting on his haunches and reaching up with his paws to pick apples, a motion that looked like he was saluting. Captain was a very big black bear, but was not very aggressive unless tested. He seemed to have an agreement with my grandmother and grandfather that if they left him alone, he would leave them alone. He just strolled by the house every now and then to have some blackberries on the bushes or apples that had fallen down, which meant he came by the house yards often, as he was too big to climb the trees, much more than fruit trees around the house were low enough he could reach up and pick the food. My grandfather guesstimated he was somewhere between 500 to 600 pounds and roughly 6 feet tall, as my grandfather once measured some scratch marks he had left on a tree. During the week, my grandmother noticed a fairly sharp decline in the animals nearby. It was the latter part of summer in a wet season, so most of the plants were in full bloom and their leaves were at their tenderest. Yet, she couldn't see hide nor hair of any rabbits or deer coming to graze. A coyote, she said, that had been yapping for every night for the past 5 months seemed to vanish. A few neighbors, by neighbors I mean people who lived within 5 miles, who stopped by, told her something had taken their dog and their chicken coop had been smashed into. They assumed the mountain lion had lurked about had done it, since it was the only other thing that could feasibly take down a large farm dog, as they had seen Captain the day after in complete different area gorging himself on a dead deer. They checked around, they couldn't find anything. The next night my grandmother was woken up by my aunt, who told her that she heard something bang outside the wall. They checked around the morning after and found one of the deer butchered with a bloody smear on the wall. Judging from the way the gravel was disturbed, the deer had been walking by the house when something ambushed it, and in the struggle it had gotten smacked against the wall. My grandmother, having grown up in the woods, was familiar with predator kills and methods. Mountain lions tend to jump on the back and rake their claws across the flanks to hold on as they bite the neck. Black bears will usually break the neck or back with their paws while biting the head. And the rare occasions coyotes attack deer, they usually do it by biting down on the inside of the leg and twisting to rip the muscle and arteries. This kill clearly had the throat ripped out, but there weren't any claw marks to be found, and the bite looked narrower than what a cougar would. Plus, she could gander there was only one predator from the way the ground had been disturbed, which didn't make any sense, for coyotes typically traveled in pairs and hunted in pairs. One alone isn't enough to bring down a full-grown deer. After disposing of the carcass, the next few nights were relatively uneventful, except for the fact that several times my aunt or grandmother would be woken in the middle of the night by the sound of something panting outside. Now, in these woods, you could hear a pin drop if it was close enough to some points. They could swear the animal making the panting was directly outside the wall. One day, my grandmother was picking some berries when she noticed what looked like dog tracks of a very large hound going through the mud, flat bordering the near stream. Thinking it might be a missing farm dog who had maybe just run away, she followed the tracks until she heard something loudly growling at her from across the stream. She looked up to see the partially obscured face of what looked like a huge, bulky, brown-colored coyote or wolf standing in the thicket on the other side of the stream. She quickly began to back away, glancing back only to check her footing on the slope that led down to the stream. When she looked back, she saw a very distinctly canine face in much greater detail because the animal had moved out from under cover. But instead of stepping out of the leaves like she thought it had at first, she noticed that it was instead standing up on its hind legs and peering over the shrubs. Now, she had seen canines stand upright before. Dogs do it, foxes can do it, coyotes sometimes do it. It was the size that took her off guard. She had been to that exact same thicket of shrubs just the other day, and her head only just barely reached the top. And my grandmother was around 5'3". This thing's head pitched clear over the shrubs with a little bit extra visibility. And usually when a predator is making no attempt to hide, it's usually because it's trying to intimidate something. My grandmother managed to back away to the hill without turning around, and when she started to get out of sight of the creature, stepped out of the thicket on its hind legs. It strolled forward in a very uncanny way she had trouble describing, but she insisted it never went back down on all fours. Needless to say, she ran to the house in a backpedal sprint. That night they heard the panting again, along with a distant howl and scraping sounds. They found the garage door, back door frame, and kitchen window frame all had claw marks on them from something investigating. The canine creature was seen a few more times across the week by my grandmother and neighbors, usually on or near the area of my family's property. My aunt finally saw it when she saw a pair of fuzzy ears outside her window. Now, she wasn't startled right off the bat from this, as Captain had come to her window a few times before, and she gradually lost some fear of the big bear over years. But in this case, his ears just barely reached the edge of the windowsill, whereas in case you could clearly see them in the top of their owner's head. She quickly realized it wasn't the bear because of the pointed shape, brown coloring, and the fact that it had two fully intact ears. They also stared to detect a very pungent smell on the side porch, one time finding what looked like some urine or some other liquid stains on it, suggesting an animal had scent marked to claim its spot. It all came to a head on a Wednesday night when they heard howling in the distance grow closer. My grandmother flipped on the porch light and glimpsed the canine animal quickly sprinting across the lawn on its hind legs again. Her sighting confirmed how big it was. She had seen timber wolves at the zoo up to 150 pounds, and she was certain this was at least a bit more than twice that size. For several hours of that night, they could hear it roaming around the property and pressing against doors like it was trying to find a way in. They glimpsed at several points eye shine of yellow eyes peering through the windows, as well as a broad, long-fingered paw being pushed against the glass briefly. This was the day and age before cell phones and 24-hour police service in some rural areas, so no one had means of immediately calling the police. Instead, my grandmother had to wait many minutes on the dial line with connection difficulty trying to call the police station 2 towns over. She was distracted by my aunt screaming, running into the bedroom to get one of the guns out. She had been sitting in the living room when she felt clicking against the glass and saw the wolf thing pressing its face and baring teeth against the surface with its claws fully outstretched. Both of them started to try to get the rifles and shotguns out. It was becoming increasingly clear that the creature was trying to get into the house, and they knew that it was going to be rough. They heard it panting through the wall before there was a sound of heavy footsteps and a very loud thump. With a flash of fur on the edge of the window, they ran to the innermost room, the pantry locker, and stayed in there with their guns. Now, it's not like in the movies when creatures roar, snarl, and hiss constantly, no matter what they're doing, but they did manage to hear a commotion outside. My aunt and grandmother hadn't the faintest idea of what was going on and didn't investigate until the morning after. But they could tell something was antagonizing the other thing, with occasional grunts, barks, and rumbles were audible through the blackness for about a minute and gradually moved off. They found no bodies, but there'd clearly been a ferocious altercation. The ground was ripped up in multiple spots, the wall had a dent in it, and there was some oxidized blood traces in the grass and dirt. My grandmother also found a trail where something had charged through the shrubs to recover several vague dog prints as well as wider tracks moving in the same direction. The animals all seemed to come back by the end of the week and the howl stopped. When my grandfather came back home, he, my aunt, and some neighbors surveyed the area to make sure they couldn't find the wolf creature. Evidently, the neighbors had also heard howls around their property at night that stopped recently as well. They couldn't find it despite surveying the whole property, though they did find what looked like a track way leading out of the property and running off into the mountains. Several days later, my grandmother saw Captain again, marking his territory by rubbing up against a tree in their yard and scratching the bark. He had several cuts across his muzzle, was missing patches of fur, and had some healed bite wounds on his arms. And the hole in his ear had been torn open to the point it was missing half of the top flap. But other than that, and a slight limp that went away with time, he was fine. My aunt joked he looked rather proud of himself. When he told us about the urine-like smell on the doorstep when the wolf creature was running amok, my grandfather speculated it was trying to claim its territory. Usually black bears are relatively docile, but evidently Captain took an issue with this newcomer imposing on his space and became aggressive. So what my grandmother and aunt heard that one night was the bear charging while it was distracted and engaged the intruder. While the wolf-looking creature was taller, it seemed skinnier and less massive, and apparently in the confrontation and threat displayed that likely followed, sheer bulk won. Apparently, it decided it wasn't worth claiming its spot if it meant having to square off with a quarter-ton claws and teeth. Captain had run the intruder off to protect his territory and coincidentally help my family. As a thank you, and so he could recover his strength quicker, my grandmother trimmed the apple trees down, all the fruit, and let the bear enjoy himself without feeding him directly. Don't want to associate humans with food. Winter would be in a few months, and she wanted to have him fattened up so he could stick around for next year, just in case. As she put it, the forest will always have a boss, and it's better to have one who's not interested in eating you. Decades have gone by, and while both my grandparents and Captain have passed, the Dogman creature never returned. There's been about 3 black bears who moved into Captain's place since, and each has grown about as big as he was. Thankfully, that seemed to have been enough to ward off any large canines that walk upright. I told you guys, that right there was an amazing Dogman encounter. One of the best ones I've ever heard. I mean, you really never hear a black bear fighting a Dogman. I've heard where they've palled up before and been seen walking together, but you know, this captain was extraordinarily, just a friend of this family, and he wanted to protect his land, and Just an amazing story. I smiled reading it. Um, I want to apologize for the sound with the mic. I've had some mic issues and I'm fixing them as we go. So I'm using a older mic right now. My Yeti will be able to be used again probably Friday or Saturday. Hopefully, I'll have that issue resolved. But anyway, I liked the story. I hope you guys liked it. I've got lots more to come. Once again, I just needed a break. I had to kind of get boosted up again, and I really missed you guys. Thanks for all the support. Thanks for all the comments. Thanks for the new subscribers, the old subscribers, and I'll have a new story very soon. I also am going to be doing a Thunderbird story for a good friend of mine, the Disciple, and yeah, so I hope you guys stick around and listen to that one too. Anyway, with that, guys, have a great night, and thanks for listening.